Welcome to my November essay on third spaces, elections, and consent. I have to be honest, this essay has been through a ringer. At the start of November, it was an essay mostly on labor organization, but this past Monday, right before the election, I scrapped that idea because I wanted to focus on something that felt more immediate and relevant to me, which was these ideas of consent, mutual design, courage, risk, our relation to power. And what you're about to read is partially what I wrote on Monday before Trump was reelected, when I thought Harris would probably win. And then part of the essay is also followed by some thoughts post-election. This essay is both shorter and maybe less organized than some of my other ones, but I hope you enjoy it anyway. It is Election Day here in the United States, and in Pennsylvania, the single most critical state for deciding the most president. The political messaging has been pretty relentless. For weeks, I've received 5 to 10 political texts every day, and every television ad has been for one candidate or another. Some of my relatives outside the city have changed their Facebook profile pictures to fist-pumping Trumps. And while my stance on Kamala Harris is mixed at best, I did vote for her with the same enthusiasm that I've brought to every Democratic candidate that has run in my adult life. An enthusiasm which is tepid at best, with the exception perhaps of my very first time voting for Obama in 2008. I canvassed for Harris, although I discovered that knocking on strangers' doors is terribly scary to do when you're by yourself. It was actually a pretty striking experience. For all my courage in other areas of my life, walking up to a stranger's door and knocking on it was something I couldn't really do. Phone banking, no problem. Canvassing on the street, did that pretty easily through my 20s. Knocking on doors was terrifying in a way I can't quite describe. It brought up a bunch of questions for me. Why was I so scared to knock on doors? Should I overcome this particular fear? What would the cost of overcoming that fear actually be? Is that what circus students feel like sometimes when we're in class? What response from my friends and the people I was with did I need at that moment when I couldn't knock on a door? How do we know whether to push through a fear or accept it? How do we make that call for our students? Are there times when coercion is useful in teaching movement, especially when we're dealing with fear? Whether or not coercion is useful, is it ever ethical? When was the last time that you were scared or uncomfortable? Really scared? How did you deal with it? These are questions that I grapple with as both a teacher and a participant in my classes, but also in society where hierarchical structures are so deeply ingrained. Often, I think that we silo our thinking about consent to romantic or sexual encounters. But if you think about it for just a moment, it seems so clear to me that consent practices permeate government, medicine, employment, other areas of our life. These forms of consent or non-consent are more invisible, an accepted characteristic of the water that we swim in. Consider the consent of the governed in politics, or informed consent in medicine, or contractual agreements in employment. When was the last time that you broke a law, or really negotiated with your employer, or really felt in control of your relationship with healthcare? I think it's a mistake to think about consent in an isolated way. It's not just about my personal interactions around touch or my interpersonal relationships with students or coworkers. It's also about the structure of my classes, the way that I interact with power, the implicit and explicit agreements between me and my students. My friend Sarah Casper once shared that she doesn't use the word consent a lot in her actual teaching about consent. I remember that she had a few reasons, but one that stuck with me was because in her view, consent practice consists of a whole lot of smaller social skills, things like asking permission, giving permission, listening, checking in, reading body language, being confrontational, things like that. Pretending that consent is just one thing, permission, limits the scope to a single transactional interaction instead of letting it be a larger, more encompassing concept. This framing, looking at little interactions, the little interactions that constitute consent, is really eye-opening for me when I think more concretely about government, power, violence, coercion, and even education. Questions like, did I agree to the Electoral College? Do I think that the laws I live under are good, just, or agreeable? Do I follow them anyway? How and when have I meaningfully participated in my own medical care? What would I do if another person treated me the way that the government treats me? Does the power of the state derive from something other than the threat of violence? If so, what? If I don't agree with a mode of interacting, for example, voting, does my participation in it imply my agreement? Does my non-participation imply my protest? Should I pay my taxes this year, knowing how my money gets used? Is it really even my money, or is it the government's money or the bank's money? By controlling a representation of value, does the state gain control of my time? Do I own or control anything other than my time? What is the appropriate reaction to the constant implied violence of the state? If there is no state violence, aka no prison, no police, what would change about my life or the lives of people around me? How much of my understanding of teaching and learning comes from my experience of school and education? What role does consent or mutual design play in my life or in the lives of children? What does youth leadership really look like in a movement class, and is it appropriate? What does any of this have to do with teaching movement arts? Is it possible that movement classes are based in modes of relation that we absorb from the world around us? Does changing how we teach movement or how we learn movement change how we live our lives? Is it possible that we can change the world by teaching movement differently? One of the critical roles of movement educators, I believe, is to provide students with a real lived experience of structured, non-hierarchical social interaction. I actually think that's a pretty high calling. In work or in school, structure and hierarchy come together. In some non-traditional spaces, they might make efforts to make hierarchy disappear, but oftentimes, in the absence of hierarchy, organization disappears as well. Finding non-hierarchical structure for interaction is rare. Traditional hierarchies dominate most aspects of our lives, but in movement class, we have a chance to create environments where power is decentralized and collaboration becomes more central. Risk-centric movement teaching, especially, can foreground this tension between safety and authority on one hand and freedom and risk on the other. I think the best excuse for exercising authority and obedience is that it keeps people safe, and that we understand that safety or security often come at the cost of freedom. By the same token, freedom is risky. And if we think of this tensioned interplay in our movement classes and then extrapolate from it to think about the world at large and the government and how these same tensions are exploited, in those contexts, I think there's some juice there. How do we as movement teachers respond to risk? What does that teach our communities about how they should respond to risk? How do we teach our students to respond to their own feelings of nervousness? What checks and balances do we, as movement teachers, have on our authority in our classes? Are these checks voluntary or are they structural? If a student wants to do something that I think is too risky, what approach do they take? And then I have a small plug here. If you haven't taken or seen the fact that I have a hour-long class, about 60 minutes, on risk itself, unpacking risk management and risk tolerance and risk assessment, then you should definitely go check that out. There's a link in the email. All of those were my pre-election thoughts, and the next section of the essay is on my post-election thoughts. After the election, I've been thinking a lot about the role of a movement or circus teacher, particularly now, and how it can feel very sharply pointless. The world is falling apart. Come learn to climb a fabric and twirl in the air. Everything is on fire. Maybe you should spend some money learning to do a handstand. This is how I feel sometimes about my work as a movement teacher at moments like this. And the morning after the election, I had 2 classes to teach. And like any reasonable person, I definitely thought about canceling them. And I'm glad I didn't, because when I showed up, they started to show me what that role was. I start all of my classes with a bit of a social warm-up because I am 0.0000 forever percent interested in the sort of anonymous yoga-style drop-in class where no one learns each other's names and the teacher just feeds you tricks. I could not possibly be less interested. I understand that some people want their movement classes to be some form of escape, but I just patently reject that idea. Escape is a privilege that we cannot afford, especially now. So we started class and everyone cried a bit or raged a bit and shared their feelings, shared their hope or their despair or their confusion. I was so angry. I still am a little bit, but because I am white and mask presenting, I really shy away from expressing anger or even admitting when I am angry. I have this deep feeling that my anger specifically, is too dangerous to be expressed in front of anyone. On 2 occasions in my life, I have been invited to share my anger, and I have to say that it feels so good. And one of those times was yesterday when I said how angry I was, and someone said, this is an okay place to share anger, because it's really rare that I get invited to share that anger. If someone wants to attend a class that's not about community building in this way, they can go somewhere else. There are lots of places where you can find just a class that doesn't build community. The fact that I build community into my classes is how I bring politics into my class. And that is where I find solace in my work at the moment. In the fact that I'm a builder of a third space, a space where people go that isn't home or work. I live in Pennsylvania, and so I have had folks who voted for Trump in my classes, and I really think that's a good thing. They learned what pronouns were, they made their first queer friends, they had a great time, they saw community. One of them even became a great friend of mine for a while, and I remember when they said, everyone here is just so nice. Maybe that changed who they voted for, maybe not. But nothing else I ever said or did with this friend seemed to budge them at all. Avoiding them, chastising them in order to protect my own sense of safety and comfort definitely did not work out. The only times I felt like I maybe moved the needle was when we connected around our distaste for rich people and politicians. So I end this thinking here. If you create or participate in creating someone's third space, then take that work really seriously. How you create those spaces, the values and structures you use to create those spaces matter. And most important to me at the moment, find a way to give people access to third spaces and classes in ways that they can afford. Not through a scholarship program that they apply for. No one has time for that. And I'm also not talking about creating a welcoming environment for marginalized races or for queer people. I'm not talking about creating spaces for disabled folks. I'm not talking about learning about different body shapes and creating space in your classes for different body shapes. I'm specifically talking about creating low-cost classes for people who can't afford them. To be honest, I always really hate it when straight people try to make queer space. The job isn't to create queer space. Your job, if you're straight, is to make sure that your straight space is less harmful to me. But when it comes to creating queer spaces, I've got that. We will take care of our queer needs ourselves. Thank you. You can stop there. Just make sure your space is safe for me, and that's enough. Those are all really big, important things, and I am not talking about them right now. What I am talking about right now is having one free class a week. Right now, I am talking about having multiple pay-what-you-can options or sliding scales. Right now, I'm talking about direct partnerships with mutual aid organizations in your area. Radical, full-throated financial access to your classes or your third space. I do not really care if this seems like a bad business plan. And I am not saying that you should convert everything you do and tank your business into the ground. I am not saying that you shouldn't pay your teachers or that artists should allow their work to be free or unpaid. Everyone has to make money somewhere. I am talking specifically about dedicating part of your business plan to wealth redistribution. And don't even think about asking staff to volunteer for these opportunities. Maybe the people who need this redistribution are actually your staff, right? I think that anyone who is involved in movement or circus spaces, especially those of us who are in the arts, need to figure out our relationship to mutual aid and organizing. And I think we have a lot to offer because I really do believe that people's third spaces inform their civic life in a way that's going to be really necessary over the next few years. Take care of yourself, everyone. That's the November essay.